Ho! Well, how's it going? We're back. Marty from Anna's Anchor here. We just released our new single, Function Room Floor, that's coming off our album, The Merries, which is out in July 2023. And to celebrate the whole situation, I thought we'd do a little mix walkthrough of the song. So when we released our last album, I did a little video on just the overall recording and the individual tracks in one of our songs, but what was the big difference with this album was that I mixed it all myself. So I figured I'd walk you through that whole thing. And mixing was something that I've strayed away from for a long time because I just didn't really know what it comprised of. I was aware of how an album is recorded because I was sat there in the studio all the other times when we worked with producers and was watching them like a hawk. But when it came to mixing, it was just this kind of mysterious process that happened behind closed doors and I hadn't a clue. So that was something that I wanted to tackle with this record, and I learned a lot along the way, so hopefully I can show you a few things. First, before we dive into the session, one thing I wanted to point out was I mixed everything on these Sennheiser HD 600 open back headphones. Now, these were a little bit pricey. They were like $400, and I know mixing on headphones can be a divisive thing, but I've been, over the last 3 years, I've lived in 3 different rented spaces. So the idea of having nice, expensive studio monitors in a treated room, it just doesn't make sense when you're not in a permanent location. So I invested in a good pair of headphones and just did it all through that, along with monitoring out in my car and on my stereo and on my phone whenever we'd have kind of a mix together. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. Also, I should definitely give a shout out to 2 really valuable resources, which a lot of the tips and tricks I have in here have come from. One is an online program called Mix with the Masters. And if you're a student, you get a student fee for the year, and there's basically all these videos of famous producers going through songs that they've recorded. Secondly, and most importantly, Bob Cooper, who we recorded our first album with, has a Patreon where he does kind of mix rundowns on artists and clients that he's worked with. I'll put a link in the description to their info, because that, if you're looking to get into mixing, that could be a really helpful thing. Okay, so without further ado, let's get it going. So first things first, let's jump straight in and look at the mix bus. So the way I process this is I basically have all the instruments going into one mix bus, and then that is going into my 2 bus, which has all the instruments, the vocals, and all the effects. So that's the real interesting one. The main purpose for doing that is that, because the vocal is going to be the loudest thing in a mix, it's going to really affect the way your compressor works. So if you're trying to compress the music and the vocal at the same time, sometimes, it's kind of, the compressor is more than likely just going to compress the vocal and not necessarily the music. So I wanted kind of 2 different levels of compression. So in the pre-2 bus, I just have a little compressor that has a slow enough attack, low ratio, and it's basically just reducing a dB or 2 of gain, and then that all goes into the real deal mix bus or 2 bus. In that I have a bus compressor with a fast attack and a fast release, so it's just clipping our peaks. Also have this mag EQ, so we're adding a good bit of 40 kilohertz, which is in this air band, so a lot of top end, a couple of dB of 2.5 kilohertz. Then I'm cutting a bit of 160 and cutting a bit of the sub while adding in a little bit around 40. This is just overall just to clean everything up. And then we have a Pultec EQ, which is doing somewhat of a similar thing where it's boosting the lows, this time a little bit higher at 60 hertz, and also boosting some of the highs up in the air kind of frequencies. Then I just have the Pro Q3 here as just an analyzer, basically so I can see what's going on with the overall context of the mix. And then we have a limiter, and I do mix into a limiter just because the limiter affects the way the snare sounds so much that for me, I need to be kind of using a heavy limiter to really get an overall picture of how the mix is going to turn out. And on the topic of having this EQ just as a graphic, I do also have this Metric AB plugin from Plugin Alliance, which basically allows you to skip between different songs and compare and contrast them. So when I was mixing this particular song, I had three reference mixes. I basically had Runner by Alex G. It's no longer on this computer, but that's where it will be. The System Only Dreams Tonight by The National, and then Shannon Bridge off our last album. And this plugin allows you to quite literally A-B between the two, and you can have a look at the difference in the graphic readout. You can also have a look at the stereo image, the dynamics, the loudness difference between the two. When I was tackling this whole project, I was looking at some of my favorite songs through Graphic EQ, just dropping it into Logic and just looking at the overall shape of it. So I'll play a little bit here so you can just get a picture, a physical picture for how the track looks. You see here the 64 peak. This is the kick drum. This is the snare. And, you know, there's also the bass that's in and around here, and moving up along here we kind of have the guitars. And you kind of in general want the guitar area to be as smooth as possible within reason, and try and tame the kind of high end up here. But the real thing that I use this analyzer for is just looking at the kick drum. Like, I want, where does the kick drum drop off? So it drops off just around 37 hertz, which is, you know, pretty good. That's kind of what I try and achieve. You can really see the shape of a song based off of how big the kick drum is, how much of the frequencies in the low end the kick drum is taking up. What's the snare like? Do you need to clean out area around the snare to make room for the bass? Those are three essential things, really. So yeah, we'll move on and we'll take a look at the drums, which we recorded at the Nave Studio in Leeds. So we'll take a look at the kick drum here. So we got three tracks on the kick drum. We got a kick in, which was this vintage AKG mic. We got a kick out, which was a FET 47. And I am also using a little bit of sample on the kick. I know that could be kind of considered a dirty thing to some people, and I was very against samples for a long time. But when it came to mixing a song, I couldn't get the punch that I wanted in the high end off of the kick drum. It's just the way we had mic'd everything up, and it just needs an extra little kind of slap. So I'm just using Slate Trigger to actually trigger a sample of the actual drum kit that we recorded in the room. So, you know, you don't have any of the bleed of everything else, and I could, you know, EQ it the way I wanted. So that's a sample that I made myself. So hopefully that makes it sound pretty natural. On the kick in, I use this plugin called Drum Leveler, which is this really cool compressor and gate. You can see what it's doing here. This is with it engaged. This is with it out. So I'm really just using it as a gate. Then I have this SSL channel strip where we're just, you know, doing a bit of EQ, adding 8K, adding 4.5K, cutting some of the lower mids. And yeah, that's pretty much it there. And of course, Pro Q3, very aggressive EQ. And you know, this was just done to taste. You know, I'm trying to clean out all of this, you know, between, what do we have, between 60 to kind of 400 hertz. You know, this is really just bass and snare drum in this range. And the way the kick drum was recorded, it was a little bit muddier than I would have liked. So I really just had to aggressively clean that out. And then we're kind of bumping it up around the 3K range and the 7.5 to 8K range, just again to give it that pop. Then the kick out, I'm using Soothe as a bit of an EQ. And we got this console strip SSL again, where we are pulling out some of the upper mids, and we're also really cleaning out the low mids once again. So again, a very aggressive EQ. Supposed to take just those EQs alone off of what we're doing here. You hear how it sounds to be very different. You can hear it just sounds flat. It just sounds flat, boring, unexciting, and then when you add in those EQs, it makes the world of difference. Spent a lot of time on the kick drum. Moving on to the snare, we have a snare top, snare bottom. Snare top was a Bear Dynamic M201, and then the snare bottom was just a 57. And on the snare top, first of all, we have Soothe acting as an EQ. It's doing very little, just kind of boosting the mid-range side of things. Then we got the SSL console again. We're boosting at 8K, 3 dB boost to 4.5K, and then we're also boosting it around the 100 hertz mark. So this is what the snare sounds like without this SSL. With it on. This makes it pop a little bit more. I had initially tried to use drum leveler as a gate, and it just sucked the life out of it. Instead, I used this Oxford drum gate, which it just sounded a bit more natural. When we take the gate off, you can hear everything else in the background. You just have this awful fizz off the cymbals. But then with it on, just pulls it back a little bit. And when it comes to gates, I think you need to be very careful as to how much you use it, because if you completely, gate it to its absolute max, it's going to just start sounding like MIDI drums, which defeats the purpose of going to this fancy recording studio with all this amazing gear in this amazing room if you're just relying on stuff like that. And then the snare bottom, the SSL channel strip again, boosting the upper mids, pulling some of the lower mids, and boosting the kind of the fundamental frequency in the low end of the snare. Really here I'm just trying to get the crack of the snare wire to come out. We also have a EQ as well, so I'm kind of trying to do a low cut so it's not interfering with the kick drum at all, because the snare drum does have this fundamental frequency that's in and around 100 to 300 hertz, and it can really get in the way. And then also I have this little SPL transient designer from Plugin Alliance. Take it off. It's just, the aim of it is to reduce the sustain and just give it a little bit more attack, just a little bit more punch. That's the kick and the snare. Moving on to the toms, first and foremost. Basically, I have any time where the toms are not being used, I have the track just cut out. So that is a bit of a time consuming thing to go through the entire track and clear it all out. But you can see that the rack tom is only used twice in the entire song. So there's not much point in having this open mic that's just letting everything else bleed into it. So I just cut all of that out. One thing you'll notice here is there's two tracks for both toms, a high and a low. For the rack, high and the low, and for the floor. This is a tip that I got from Bob Cooper, who I'm pretty sure it came from Eric Valentine, because he does a lot of this stuff, where basically you have a high and a low floor tom tracks, so I just copied and pasted them, and you EQ them both very differently. So the high is just focusing on this band from, well, let's call it 300 hertz all the way up to, whatever, 15k, and then the low one is just focusing on this window between 50 hertz and 500 hertz. So this is kind of like your sub. If you're doing live sound, oftentimes you would send some of the toms to the sub, and this is the same principle here. Another great thing about this is we should be able to see it more in the floor tom, possibly. Okay, I didn't necessarily need to use this trick in this song, but usually when a drummer plays a drum fill, they hit the cymbals immediately afterwards, and the cymbals bleed in like hell into the rack tom mics. And if you have this high and low setup, you can actually end the high track before the low one, because when our ears hear the toms kind of resonate, we're hearing the lower frequencies, which the cymbals aren't in. So you can have the low track extended, and you can chop off that cymbal hit, which can be very beneficial. So let's just listen. We'll listen to the floor toms here. So you got the click of the rim going on. If you listen to the low one on its own, it's just really subby. And then the high almost sounds like a snare drum. And we listen to the rack tom here. We'll listen to the high first. Listen to the low. So it's really that subby sound. In terms of EQ, I showed you the overall EQ, and that's it. That's all that's going on there. I am sending them to drum reverb, which we can discuss in a minute. So one interesting thing about this song is the outro has this really cool drum fill part, which I'll play it for you in its entirety here. When we were recording that in the studio, it was quite difficult to get the beat on the floor tom to really pop out the way it should. So the engineer, actually, we put a mic underneath the floor tom and have those in, and I have those EQ'd again with the high and the low setup, but kind of gives an option to boost it and try and make it more prominent in that outro part. I also have a hi-hat mic, which I've soothed to just tame these harsh frequencies in terms of an EQ, and also Pro Q3 acting as a dynamic EQ to try and clear out the with hi-hats. I find it's just a race to try and darken them up as much as possible. I did the exact same thing with the mic that is on the ride cymbal. We move on to the overheads. So the overheads, make up quite a big element of the sound of the drums. So we have this SSL channel strip that's boosting the high mids. That's just it. That's all it's doing there. Very little. You've also got soothe to try and tame the cymbals in the overheads. And again, we got the Pro Q3, which is something I use a lot. And I use this to just examine the peaks of certain frequencies and then just pull them down. Just getting rid of some of the nasty cymbals. And then lastly, we have this API bus compressor from Universal Audio, which it's doing up as far as 4 dBs of gain reduction in the choruses. So if we listen to the overheads without the plugins, this is what we got. And with them. It's just way more controlled. It's just the the goal of taming the cymbals as much as possible. We also had this balcony mic, which I just didn't use in the mix. It was the recording was done in this big church, and there was a mic right up the top on this balcony part, but it's just too boomy, so didn't use it. And we had a set of room mics. I forget what microphone this was. Same thing done here with Suit to tame the cymbals. Got the SSL. We are cutting high mids, cutting low mids. Yeah, just trying to clean everything up. And then the Pro Q3, again, for whatever reason, 200 hertz was just sticking out. And that's the room mics. We also were really lucky that the studio that we recorded the drums in the nave had a load of outboard gear, and we actually recorded a rough drum mix through this LA2A fancy compressor, hardware compressor, and that's this track. So it's our drum comp. So instead of having parallel compression actually in the DAW, I have it from the actual session using the hardware compressor. You just hear how huge the kick drum sounds with that compressor, which is just such a huge part of the overall mix. So in terms of routing, I have all of the drum shells going to one specific bus. Then I have all the cymbals going to another, anything that has the metals in it. I have the room mics, percussion, and I also have drum reverb, which and snare and toms are going to. That's using this UAD Hitsville reverb chamber. So that's the main drum reverb. And then I also have a drum bus, which is labeled all drums. And on that, we have more bus compression. We have this EQ that's boosting 12.5K, 5K, 2K, cutting the lower mids, giving us a bit more bass. And we also have this tape machine. So if we were to listen to that without these drum bus plugins, this is what we got. Fire them on. It's not doing a ton, it's just doing a little bit. And you want to be careful when it comes to these bus channels that you're not doing too much. Initially, when the first round of mixing this, I was just crushing the snare with the compression, and it was just not working. So I had to go a little bit easier on everything. All right, so that was the drums. Moving on to the bass. I actually recorded the bass in this room here, just straight into the computer using my Fender Mustang bass. And that was going into a Line 6 HX Stomp, and I was using the amp modeler on the Stomp. It was actually a preset that I downloaded from Rick Beato's website, and I did adjust it, but it's basically an Ampeg head that's been modeled in it. And for pretty much all of our albums, it's been a similar setup for bass in that it's been, DI straight into the computer. And then putting some kind of amp modeler on it. This time around, I just used the amp modeling within the HX Stomp, and I loved how it sounded. So yeah, let's jump in here and take a look at it. So we have two bass tracks here, and they're basically just a duplicate of each other. And we basically got one that's the low frequencies, and one that is the higher kind of clacky note. Again, Got this from Bob Cooper and Eric Valentine. And I think in general, when you think about bass sound, you're imagining the kind of balance between that bottom end and the more like attack part of actually picking. So having those on two separate channels makes it so much easier to get the balance that you want. So this is what the low end sounds like. So it's heavily compressed, and we're also just using this narrow band that's between kind of 50 hertz up to 500, and we're really just trying to notch out this pocket of space in the low end so it doesn't get in the way of the kick drum, but that it has its own thing. And then I just compress the living bejesus out of it, so it's just one kind of constant driving force. And then if we listen to the note part, it just kind of sounds like a broken radio, but it's being heavily compressed with this Townhouse bus compressor, which is from Plug-in Alliance, that I love. And then we're also basically kind of doing the inverse EQ wise, where we're notching out this higher pocket. But then when you put the two of them together, and to me, that sounds the way I want a bass to sound. So splitting them up into those two separate tracks was a big deal. If we take a look at the all bass channel, there is something going on here. I'm basically using this plugin called Track Spacer to sidechain the bass and the kick and the snare, so that when the kick and the snare hit, the bass gets pulled down ever so slightly. So if we solo the drums and the bass, you'll see what I'm talking about. So this is again trying to give just a little bit more room to the kick and the snare. So this white line being dipped down is the reduction. It's very, very slight, but it adds something, I think. So we listen to all the drums and the bass together. Alright, let's move on to my favorite part, the guitars. Recording the guitars for this song was really tricky. Initially, I recorded them through my vintage 1972 Gibson ES335 going into this vintage 1972 Fender Champ. How fancy is that I have this vintage gear? But this is for the rhythm guitar, and when it came to actually mixing it, it just didn't work. It sounded flat, it sounded flabby. So actually when it came to mixing the song, I re-recorded all of the rhythm guitars, which is, you know, a luxury you would not have if you weren't mixing something yourself. And believe it or not, the re-recorded version is my Fender Telecaster going into the HX Stomp amp modeler, and it's a Fender Twin model that's in it. And I know it sounds crazy, you know, swapping out all of this vintage gear, but it just didn't work. So if we can take a quick listen to the rhythm guitars here. And it's just one take the entire way through, which is something that I really like doing, rather than breaking up verse, chorus, you know, trying to play the song the entire way through. This is what the rhythm guitar sounds like. And in that, I am EQing out a few little bits there. I'm using this channel strip to give it a little bit of presence in the kind of 700 hertz range, and also trying to pull a little bit back in the upper mids. And again, another EQ that's just pulling out some nasty frequencies. And of course that was double tracked, so left and right. If we listen to, these are the original ones that we had. Just in the context of the overall mix, it did not work at all. I also basically triple tracked the intro because it's so kind of got the, you know, this kind of intricate picky part. That was just to try and get that little bit to ring out. Then when the chorus kicks in, we got this lead guitar, which was recorded with my Reverend into the Fender Champ. You can tell, again, I'm primarily using these EQs as a means to clean out all the frequencies that we don't need. So you don't need anything below this 100 Hertz in the guitar, and it does make a huge difference. Underneath that lead guitar, I added in a extra rhythm guitar using the Gibson, just to, because it's got the humbuckers, it's, you know, chunkier. For to listen to all these guitars then together, sounds something like this. So we got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guitar tracks, which is not that much in comparison to, you know, most modern songs. There of course was these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other guitar tracks that I never used, unfortunately. I am sending some of the guitars to this reverb channel to act as like a room mic, because I didn't have the luxury of having a room mic. This is Universal Audio Capital Chambers. Now if we take a look at the guitar bus, we've got another EQ pulling out the spikes, bus compressor, which is not really 2 dBs of reduction. And then soothe again to tame this kind of 2K range, which, you know, can be really spiky and harsh with guitar. I'm definitely bad for really putting too much of that into my guitar tone. So we're going very fucking hipster with this new album and really focusing on a lot of synthesizers, because that's just the way you're meant to go with something when you've done multiple albums, isn't it? So we can dive in here now and look at a few of the different synth sounds on this song. Very first thing we hear is this kind of drone, 2 different droney synths, solo them here. So one has just this one note with a kind of infinity trail. I have all these effects going on. It's just an organ, Universal Audio organ, going through a reverb, and as well as a channel strip to kind of drive it a bit harder, make it distort, another reverb, a delay, echo boy, a compressor to compress all of that, an EQ to shape it, and then a tremolo to kind of get it to move a little bit. An absolute ball of effects, just kept adding them on and on. And then the one that actually has a slight bit of a melody is just a Prophet, with this particular preset that I made. And yeah, this is just absolutely my favorite synth, at least in the digital domain. So I'm using some of the effects up here as well. So we got a bit of chorus, a bit of delay, and yeah, that gives the intro a bit of kind of ethereal feeling. We also have bass as well. It just felt a bit, I don't know, I feel like there's something special when it takes a while for the bass to actually properly kick in. So I put synth bass in for the first kind of, for the first verse basically, so you don't hear the real bass kick in until the pre-chorus. So the synth bass is this Moog Universal Audio one. Again, going through this preamp, EQ pushing the low ends, tremo to give it the bum 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 bum, and a bit of verb. So when you hear all of those together at the start of the song, we got something to this effect. I just record those with a little MIDI keyboard or even the Magic keyboard just on the screen. Nothing too special there. In the chorus, we got a bit of piano. I am not very good at piano. This is where I wish I had Claire O'Brien to be able to step in, but basically I just punch in each individual chord and play a triad, so it sounds like this. And you can even see the chord numbers are labeled, and I went kind of to speed the songwriting process because I'm not good at piano. I actually made like a MIDI template of every chord in every major and minor scale, so I can just be like, okay, this is in G sharp or A flat. Okay, these are the seven chords, and I can just pull and drag them in. So that's why they're all labeled, 2 1 4 1 4 1 5 5. We also have some lead synth, which is kind of mimicking the lead guitar, and this is something I like to do a lot, where I'll have the synth play a very similar thing and have it pan to one ear and the lead guitar to another. And this is the Moog again, but higher pitched, and it's going through the same kind of effects that we talked about a moment ago. So I'm trying to, if I solo that with the lead guitar, you can listen to them together. They're both kind of playing off each other just to add an extra little bit of a texture. And that is pretty much it until we get to the outro, where we have a bunch of different things. Let's have a listen here. So that's our chorus. We got a piano just going da 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 towards the outro. I'm an absolute sucker for just piano notes that are just like da da, just eighth notes. So that's that, and you hear it all together. Just wanted to sound, like an airplane taking off, like, here we go, we're gone, out the door. And then at the end, I got two kind of bassy synths going on. One is the organ that we heard earlier, and the other is the synth bass that we already spoke about. Sounds kind of dancey. Pure euphoria, mate. Alright, and that's it for the synth. So the last thing to speak about is the vocals, and I recorded the lead vocals using this Jay-Z Mike's V67. That's like a model of a Neumann U67. And I actually, luckily, my own office at the university that I work at used to be a radio station. It's this perfectly treated room, so I tracked the vocals in there. And the changes went from the mic through my Apollo Twin interface, and then it went through the Universal Audio console with a couple of those plugins, so that it's getting a bit of compression straight in, so that I don't have an absolute ton of work to do with the vocals. And then Claire O'Brien did the backing vocals in this song, and Claire actually recorded the vocals herself on this and sent them over to me, because we were in different countries at the time of recording, which feels great to be in a position where, you know, we can have Brian on drums in England, Claire on the keys and backing vocals in Ireland, and me in America, and we can still all manage to write a song together. I think that's an amazing thing. So I'll jump right into the vocals here, and we'll take a look. So just looking on screen, we have a lead vocal for the verse, pre-chorus, chorus. This is kind of how I do them. I stack them going down as the song progresses, and I'll just record like 10 takes of each one and then pick and comp the best one. Verse 2. The chorus is doubled. I originally doubled the verse, and it just didn't sound as nice and as personal. It sounded bigger, but it didn't feel as intimate, so there's no doubling in the verses. So verse, I have no look. I am a bit of a sucker for kind of distortion on my vocals, so we got this, first of all, a de-esser, and we got this EQ, a compressor, and bearing in mind we got some compression going on the way in, another de-esser, and then lastly, where I'm getting the main distortion from, is this devil lock. Let's have a listen.
Polished surface, worn through time.
This is without the distortion.
Polished surface, worn through time.
Put it on.
Does it make you nervous to stitch it back in line?
We are, of course, hearing a bit of reverb and delay there. So if I go to our reverb and delay channel. So then for reverb, I actually have two different types of reverb. First of all, I have this short plate. Again, Universal Audio one. And then also I have a longer one, which is this Hitsville reverb chamber again, and then kind of blending the two. So let's have a listen. This is long, short. We've also got some delay, Echo Boy. I also have some sidechain distortion going on as well with the devil lock. Once again, we got the crunch up halfway. Don't need the compression on, and have the darkness turned up. That's the best part of this plugin, is that you can darken it up, because that's one big problem when it comes to using distortion on vocals, is just it comes too harsh. We also have a compressor to distort it even more.
In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the hills.
Okay, it's probably a good time to talk about the backing vocal by Claire O'Brien, because you could hear it there mainly with the distortion. So this is it soloed.
In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the hills, there's a place that is your own. If we met when we were kids, I think.
So in here we got a harmony over the top of it. Solo, all the vocals in the chorus, we got this.
In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the hills, there's a place that is your own. If we met when we were kids, I think that this might have been it. And if the sky could be...
So all the vocals are once again going into this bus here, and there is a compressor on it again.
In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the...
which is hitting it super hard, about 10 dBs of gain reduction there. And that is basically all the tracks. So all of them are broken down into groups. So we've got all drums, all bass, all synth, lead, vox. This is actually the lead and the backing vocals, all the guitars. And we've got our instrumental bus, and we've got our main output bus. And that is the entire mix. How about we listen to the chorus here, and I'll show you the difference that the master bus effects make. So let's listen to it on. And I'll take all the EQ and compression. I'll leave the limiter on. In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the hills, there's a place that is your own. If we met when we were kids, I think that this. And again, put it all on. In the crack between the rivers and the mountains and the hills, there's a place that is your own. If we met when we were kids, I think that this might have been it. And if the sky could meet the ocean, offer up a second chance, I wouldn't waste a moment for you. So that was the mix of Function Room Floor. And there's nothing too crazy about it. You know, it all really just boils down to EQ and compression and understanding the fundamental frequencies of each individual instrument and understanding what it can potentially disrupt and get in the way of. And after that, understanding how much it should or shouldn't be compressed. And then it's a case of just managing the levels of everything. You know, it really is as simple as that. If you can use EQ and compression smartly, that's it. I'm not really a big buyer into, you know, oh, this one plugin is just the answer to everything. If you have an EQ, a compressor, a bit of reverb, a bit of delay on whatever computer or DAW it is you're using, that's all you need to, you know, make a fantastic mix. And I'm by no means, you know, at the end of my journey with mixing. All of this is I'm still learning as I go, and will hopefully continue. And I hope this was some bit helpful for you. If you have any questions, just leave it below in the comments and I'll definitely get back to you. Alright, until next time, good luck!